Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with the story, Hallowed Ground, Part 1, penned by the twisted mind of the Vesper's bell. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow fear fanatics and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us. So feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, Hallowed Ground. Part 1. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. I don't think there's anything more beautiful than a cemetery in the fall. Though I love cemeteries, no matter the season. There's normally an abundance of majestically tall trees, more than you typically find in a public park, but not so many that they obstruct your view, like in the woods. At the peak of autumn, you're treated to a panoramic vista of vibrantly colored foliage, dangling from the branches and blanketing the ground, rustling in the wind and crunching underfoot. The gravestones themselves have an apothic allure to them, ruggedly cut slabs of polished slate or granite or marble, their dark bodies glistening ever so slightly in the dappled sunlight, meticulously arranged row by row in solemn respect to those they stand in memorial to. What I love the most, though, is the serenity, the tranquility, the quiet. Aside from the occasional funeral, they're often entirely empty of visitors, and virtually never have more than a few at a time. The memento mori of rotting corpses only 6 feet underground must sour most people on the otherwise gorgeous landscaping. Not me, though. I guess I'm something of a misanthropic loner to seek out solitude in the confines of a graveyard. But reminders of mortality don't bother me. It's comforting, if anything, that we set aside such charming sanctuaries for the dead. It was on the first day of October 2018 that I came across a new cemetery, one I had never been to before or even knew existed. I was taking a scenic route home along the countryside roads to admire the fall landscape when I spotted the weathered gravestones up ahead. Pleasantly surprised at my discovery, I turned in without a second thought. The corroded metal arch over the gates only read cemetery. If the sign had ever borne a name, those letters had long since rusted away. It wasn't a large cemetery, maybe a little over 100 yards across by a couple hundred long with a single looping gravel path. So I parked my car and explored it on foot. I was immediately enthralled by its pristine silence. I couldn't hear even the most distant sign of human activity. The only noises were the cawing of crows, the scampering of small animals, and the wind blowing through the trees. The towering oaks and maples that populated the graveyard were stunningly dressed in their fall colors beneath the somber gray sky. But the gravestones themselves were a different story. None of them were recent, and most were so worn they couldn't even be read anymore. There were only 2 structures still standing upon the grounds: the dilapidated remains of a maintenance shed and a small marble mausoleum, my entrance barred by an iron gate. I walked the entire length of the cemetery, searching for any sign of recent activity. Plant overgrowth was limited, but that looked more like the work of grazing wildlife than a groundskeeper, and I came to the conclusion the place must be abandoned. I was ecstatic. A small, quaint, aged cemetery all to myself. I came back a couple of days later and reclined up against a large gravestone that I thought gave the best view, with a book in one hand and a pumpkin spice latte in the other. I wasn't usually so casual about my behavior in cemeteries, in case someone came across me and deemed it disrespectful. But after a brief web search on Ecosia yielded absolutely nothing about the cemetery. I was certain it was abandoned. If there's one thing people find creepier than cemeteries, It's abandoned, isolated, decaying cemeteries. I was quite confident that I wouldn't be bothered, and that the long-forgotten person beneath me would be grateful for any attention at all after such prolonged neglect. Once I had finished my drink and a couple of chapters of my book, I decided to get up and stretch my legs a bit. I nearly screamed out loud when I saw a man in a long black coat and wide-brimmed hat standing over a grave near the cemetery exit. In a more ordinary cemetery, his presence wouldn't have been much cause for concern. But I was so utterly convinced that this place had been abandoned for ages that it seemed next to impossible that he was just paying his respects. My mind immediately assumed the worst, that he had seen me come in here and hoped to take advantage of my isolated state. If I were to scream at the top of my lungs out here, would anyone else even hear it? I dropped back down behind the gravestone, waiting to see what he would do. He continued standing over the same grave, barely moving, and giving no indication that he even knew I was there. I pulled out my phone in the hopes of calling someone to pick me up, only to see that I had no reception. Not entirely unexpected, given the rural area I was in, but I still cursed my luck. 20 minutes to half an hour went by with no change, and I realized it was going to start getting dark soon. I decided it was better to walk past this guy in daylight than to risk being trapped with him in a graveyard at night. And it wasn't like I was completely defenseless either. Being a woman with a penchant for wandering by herself in lonely areas, I had made it a habit to carry a small can of mace on my person, and I had taken some basic self-defense classes. Gathering my things with my mace concealed in the palm of my hand, I set off towards the exit, following the route that kept me the furthest from the stranger. I kept my gait steady, my breathing soft and level, and my gaze ever flicking back and forth between my car and the dark figure. At the sound of my footfalls drawing near, he listlessly lifted his head, gave a perfunctory nod, and, to my great relief, let me pass without incident. A few days went by before I went back to the cemetery. My encounter with the stranger had left me a bit spooked, but since he'd done nothing to actually threaten me, maybe his presence there had been innocent after all. All I knew was that the spot was far too beautiful and secluded to give up without a more tangible threat to my safety. I went out for another leisurely country drive that eventually took me back to the cemetery, and as soon as I pulled into the entrance, there he was again. Or possibly, there he was still, since he was standing over the exact same grave with his back to me. Part of me wanted to back up and get the hell out of there. But at that point, I honestly was more curious than scared. If he had intended to do me harm, he could have done it the first time we were in the cemetery together. And it didn't really make any sense that he would be lurking out in the open to ambush me days later, on the off chance that I would come back. So, what the hell was he doing then? And how did he get here? I didn't see any other vehicles around, though that had escaped my attention during our first encounter. Now that I wasn't cornered, he didn't look nearly as threatening as he had before. Instead, he seemed a forlorn, almost tragic figure standing over that grave. My curiosity was piqued, and I was resolved not to give up the cemetery. So, I decided to speak with him, shooting off a text to an acquaintance as a minimal precaution, which didn't send immediately thanks to the poor reception, and palming my mace, I stepped out of my vehicle and approached him. As I neared, confidence surged within me. Noticing his coat added a significant illusion of bulk. In reality, he was a frail man. His cheekbones, sharp and pronounced, towered over sunken cheeks, and under his eyes lay dark circles. His skin was pale yet strangely. It bore an almost silvery luster. His hair was a stark white, a hue too bright for someone who seemed no older than 50. But his eyes were the most peculiar feature. They were an incredibly vibrant shade of green, like two beryl gemstones embedded in his silvery white face. A shame, I thought, that such beautiful eyes might need to be met with mace. Not that it would deter me. Excuse me, sir, I managed to utter, stopping a few feet away. He lifted his head towards me, a stern melancholy etched onto his otherwise friendly face. I apologize if I'm intruding, but I saw you by this grave a few days ago. These graves all seem too ancient for anyone alive to have known the buried. I was just curious about why you're here." He nodded, seemingly cognizant of the peculiarities of his actions.
"The person buried here is an ancestor of mine. Never knew them personally, but their deeds have resonated throughout my family for generations, and it's our tradition to honor them for that,"
he explained, his voice hoarse.
"I'm the last of my bloodline now, so the honor falls to me alone."
I cast my gaze onto the moss-covered grave, scrutinizing as best I could. I could discern no identifying features other than the outline of a cross. There was a solitary purple rose on the ground, and a few silver dollars laid along the base of the gravestone.
"What about you, miss?"
he inquired.
"What brings you to this place?"
"Oh, I just like cemeteries," I confessed sheepishly. "They're pretty and quiet." He nodded, a faint smirk playing on his lips. How did you get here?" I asked. "Did someone drop you off, or do you live nearby?"
"The latter. Very much so,"
he acknowledged, pointing towards a towering evergreen tree. Beneath its sagging branches lay a tent and several plastic totes and canvas bags. "Oh, you're squatting here?" I asked, as sympathetically as possible. To my relief, his homelessness seemed to explain his emaciated frame, ill-fitting coat, and prematurely white hair, but we're miles from the nearest store. "You don't walk all the way there and then haul supplies all the way back, do you?"
"I have enough to last me till the end of the month. After that, it won't matter."
I pondered what he meant, but decided against prying further. His mental state was a mystery, especially considering the humble grave he claimed as his ancestors. I found it best to let him hold on to his beliefs. I slipped the mace back into my pocket and brought out my coin purse. "May I?" I gestured to the row of coins at the base of the gravestone. He nodded in approval, and I left a small offering for his ancestor. Or perhaps him. "Is it all right with you if I keep visiting? I really do like it here."
"It's not my cemetery, miss. Do as you please."
He agreed. "Thank you," I responded with a smile, making my way back to my car. Pausing, I felt tempted to ask his name, but decided against it to maintain my own anonymity. I frequented the cemetery throughout the rest of October, watching the foliage evolve into more vibrant colors. I purchased pumpkins from a roadside stand, spending an afternoon carving them into jack-o'-lanterns, which I then scattered across the cemetery. I befriended the semi-feral barn cats that came to hunt. I played in piles of leaves like a little girl, preserving my favorite ones in a scrapbook and generally doing as I pleased. One day, I examined each grave one by one, noting anything that piqued my interest. Angels and crosses were discernible on some of the headstones, but the only legible words were generic phrases. Phrases like, "gone too soon," "beloved wife," "husband," etc. And of course, "may she, he or they, rest in peace." Not a single gravestone bore a date or a name. The strangeness of it intrigued me, but I honestly didn't know what to make of it. Each time I visited the cemetery, I'd leave a few more coins by the ancestor's grave as an offering. Sometimes the man was there, but other times he'd be in or around his tent. There were times when he'd be wandering around the rest of the graveyard, and once I wasn't even sure if he was there at all. We acknowledged each other politely, but didn't speak much. We both sought solitude. While visiting a cemetery with a potentially unstable homeless man might seem reckless, I never felt threatened after our first conversation. There was only one time he took issue with my actions. This happened when I tried to enter the mausoleum. As I fiddled with the lock, hoping to break it, his cold hand suddenly gripped my shoulder from behind.
"That's a private mausoleum, miss. Not open to the public,"
he stated firmly.
"Leave it be."
In retrospect, his physical intervention seemed a bit overboard, but at the time, I was overwhelmed with guilt for my transgression. I stuttered an apology and scampered off to examine the maintenance shed. The most interesting thing I found there was an old, non-motorized lawnmower. On my next visit, I brought him a deli sandwich, partially as an apology for my attempt at grave robbing, partially because I brought one for myself and didn't feel right eating it in front of a homeless person, but also in the hopes of getting some information out of him. He accepted it politely, but not exactly gratefully. More like it was a pack of store-brand socks from a secret Santa. He didn't seem to care what he ate or that he was underfed. He was sure he'd make it until the end of the month, and that was enough for him. "So, how long have you been here already?" I asked between bites of my Reuben sandwich.
"Since I buried my father."
He murmured. "Buried him here?" I asked in surprise.
"Wasn't enough left for a proper burial. But this is consecrated ground, so it was good enough,"
he said with a distant nod. "I'm sure you did the best you could," I assured him. His vague, cryptic answers did make me a little uneasy, but I had developed a sense of camaraderie with my fellow graveyard enthusiast and decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, at least for the moment. "So, how much do you know about this place?" "I haven't been able to find out anything about it." "How old is it? Does it have a name? Why don't any of the tombstones have names or dates left?" The man just shook his head.
"All lost to time. Most of us are forgotten in less than 100 years after we pass. No sense in the stones keeping names when those names won't mean anything to anyone,"
he claimed. I just nodded and finished my sandwich. I didn't necessarily disagree with the sentiment, but it hardly explained the condition of the gravestones. I briefly entertained the thought that maybe he had chipped off all the dates and names, but quickly dismissed the notion. None of the gravestones appeared vandalized, just old. I eventually settled on the theory that the headstones had been mass-produced with the generic phrases pre-engraved and any personal information being only cheaply and shallowly carved, explaining why it had all eroded away. It wasn't a perfect theory, but it was the best I could think of. During the last week of October, there was a heavy rainstorm. When it started to lighten, I tossed on my coat and drove out to the cemetery, eager for the smell of wet leaves on the cool, damp air in my beloved sanctuary. When I arrived, I saw that the grave where I had been leaving my offerings had been dug up. Baffled, I ran from my car to the open grave without even shutting the door behind me. To my horror, I beheld the man, muddied and barely conscious, lying at the bottom of the freshly dug 4-foot hole. He had evidently decided to take advantage of the rain-softened earth to exhume the grave. But in his fragile, half-starved state, the excursion and the chill of the rain had been too much for him. Without hesitation, I jumped into the grave, grabbed him from under the armpits, and hoisted him up. "What the hell were you thinking?" I demanded as I slung his body up onto the ground.
I had to know for sure,"
he mumbled. That was the only lucid sentence I got out of him for a while. I dragged him back to his tent, cleaned him up, put him in a blanket, and got some water into him. As he recuperated, I started thinking about what exactly my obligations were. I had known that he probably wasn't mentally well, but I'd also thought he was harmless. Just a creepy loner who liked hanging out in graveyards. Like me. But clearly, whatever delusions he clung to had just caused him to nearly kill himself. If I didn't at least try to get him help, and he died, was I at fault for that? If I didn't get him help, then who would? But would his delusions even let him leave the cemetery peacefully? The thought of him being dragged out of here by cops to be locked up in some asylum was soul-crushing. There was also the more selfish concern about what would happen to the cemetery if I brought it to the attention of government officials. I had fallen so in love with it, I had seriously started considering buying a camper and squatting here myself.
"Thank you."
I was roused from my contemplation by the shameful and apologetic murmur from my tent mate. "You're lucky I came here when I did, dummy," I said, giving him a punitive slap across the knee. "Otherwise, you'd be just another nameless corpse right now. What were you trying to do? Do you even know?"
"It doesn't matter."
He shook his head. I groaned and shoved a cup of dollar store instant ramen into his hand. "Look, I can't stay here all night. Are you going to be okay by yourself?" I asked.
"Yes, miss. I'll be fine. Thank you."
He nodded. "Promise me you won't do any more digging, or anything else that might make you keel over," I demanded.
"I promise, miss."
I sighed and accepted that that would have to do.
I do have one small favor to ask, miss.
And what's that? I asked as I put my raincoat back on.
Halloween's my last night here. If it's not too much trouble, would you mind seeing me off?
Now, I of course wanted to know where the hell he thought he was going. But given his mental state, I figured it wouldn't actually do any good to ask. If Halloween was some sort of locus for his delusions, then it was probably best for him not to be alone. Well, it's not like I had any other plans. I acquiesced. Sure, I'll be here at dusk. I'll bring drinks and stuff. We'll have a little Halloween party. I always meant to go to one of those. Halloween night came. I set out a bowl of fun-sized candy bars with a please take 2 note posted to it, and drove off to the cemetery. I'd brought chips, dip, whiskey, and ginger ale coolers, a sandwich platter, Halloween candy, my Bluetooth speaker, and a downloaded Halloween playlist that mostly had covers of This Is Halloween, Monster Mash, and spooky, scary skeletons. Maybe not the wildest evening, but it was literally the first party I'd ever thrown. So cut me some slack. When I pulled into the cemetery, I saw that he had placed a trash can in the center and started a bonfire and surrounded it with my jack-o'-lanterns. I was a little concerned about the safety of this and that it might attract attention, but it did look amazing, and the night was cold enough that the warmth of the blaze would make the party much more enjoyable. This looks awesome. I cried as I got out of my car and donned my kitty mask, putting out the spread on my car's hood.
All I did was put some leaves in a trash can and light a match. You're the one who took the time to carve the pumpkins,
he said humbly, perched upon a headstone and staring into the fire. Yeah, I'm a real Michelangelo with gourds, I said sarcastically, handing him a fox mask. This time, you're not leaving me hanging. Tonight, you're going to eat the food I brought and you're going to enjoy it. You're my only guest, and I will not have you spoiling the evening for everyone else.
Yes, ma'am.
He chuckled, helping himself to the sandwich platter. I pulled out my phone, hit play on my music app, and started dancing to Jonathan Young's cover of the Ghostbusters theme song. Normally, I'm pretty self-conscious at social gatherings, to the point that I avoid them as much as I can without being rude. But since the only other person there was even more reserved than I was able to cut loose a bit. I danced around the fire. I sang, I drank, I feasted, and just generally made merry. It was the most fun I'd ever had at a party. A couple of hours in, and I found myself taking a breather. I leaned against my car, engaging in aimless monologue with the man. Suddenly, a robust gust of wind sprang up, extinguishing the fire in the trash bin. The abrupt loss of flame took me aback, especially since the jack-o'-lanterns managed to stay lit. An immediate chill crept in. It was so biting that I could see my breath and frost beginning to form on the ground. The sparse candlelight revealed the man shifting from his typical melancholy. He craned his neck forward. Following his gaze, I witnessed a spectacle of pale blue flames emerging one by one. They hovered in mid-air over each grave.
Miss, stay inside the ring of jack-o'-lanterns and you'll be safe,
he advised, stepping deliberately outside the protective circle.
They don't want you anyway. Your offerings have been more than sufficient. I'm the one who owes them a debt.
Wait, what are you doing? I whispered in alarm.
I told you, tonight is my last night here,
he responded calmly. The wind stirred again, howling with the ferocity of a wild beast, yet the spectral apparitions remained unswerving. What are those things? I asked, spinning frantically amidst the eerie siege of phantom fires.
Will o' the wisps,
he said solemnly.
Spirits who've been dead so long they no longer remember their human lives and thus cannot summon human form. They appear here every All Hallows Eve, when the veil between the elder world and ours is thinnest.
You've seen these things before? I queried, bewildered by both the supernatural spectacle and his nonchalant reaction. So, they're not dangerous?
No, they are. But the jack-o'-lanterns are effective wards against them,
he assured me. The wisps had begun to move, gently bobbing towards us, heedless of the wind. Well then get in here then. What are you doing? I called out. He hung his head and exhaled a sigh of resignation.
I broke my promise to you.
He confessed.
I finished digging out my ancestor, though I paced myself a little more this time. It was exactly what I was told it was. An immaculate corpse, incorruptible, perfectly preserved, after lying in the earth for centuries. But despite its perfect condition, I can't tell you a thing about it, not even if it was a man or a woman. That was part of the deal they made with the Elder Things so long ago. They traded their identity to ensure the prosperity of our family. Burying their corpse here made the cemetery hallowed to the Elder Things. It's why there are no names on the graves anymore. The wisps stole them, desperate for any semblance of humanity. It's why this place is so hard for most people to perceive, let alone remember.
Listen to me. You're not thinking clearly. Those things are just oxidizing gases from the graves, I choked out, not believing my own words. Let's just get in my car and leave, and you'll see we'll be fine.
Do not leave that ring until they're gone,
he commanded as the wisps drew nearer, slowly but steadily.
I have to do this. Part of my ancestors' deal with the Elder Things was that each of their direct descendants would eventually sacrifice themselves as well. Every one of us who broke that pact brought ever-increasing misfortune upon us until there was just me. Thank you. I thought this place would be forgotten after I was gone. I don't know why you can see and remember it, but so long as you do, the wisps won't be able to steal its identity completely. So long as you remember me, they won't be able to steal mine. And you did make my last month just a little more pleasant. Thank you.
By now, the wisps had encircled him, spinning in a languid vortex, nipping gently at him as if testing his resolve. His breath hung thick in the air. Frost began to form on his skin and clothes, and he shivered as if in the grip of Arctic chill. He reached into his pocket and produced a keyring.
The cemetery may not be mine, but the mausoleum is,
he said, tossing the keys into the ring of jack-o'-lanterns.
It's yours now, and everything inside it.
Before I could formulate a question, the wisps descended upon him in mass. He was consumed in the cold blue flames, yet he didn't burn. Instead, each wisp seemed to take a bite out of him, each piece transforming into a dark, vaporous fluid within their flames, greedily devouring him until not even a skeleton remained. I, shamefully, was not a hero that night. I screamed and cried at the sight of him being eaten alive, weeping and cowering as the wisps circled my protective ring. All I could do was pray that the jack-o'-lanterns wouldn't burn out. In the days that followed, I often questioned if I should hold a grudge against him for inviting me to watch his final moments. If he had disclosed his plan, I never would have believed him and would have insisted on being there anyway to ensure he didn't harm himself. Even in the aftermath, I wouldn't have accepted the truth if I hadn't witnessed it myself. I never would have known his fate otherwise, and am grateful he didn't have to face it alone. So perhaps it's for the best. It's hard to remain angry at the departed anyway. Once I understood the unique nature of the cemetery, I resolved to live here. I gave my landlord a month's notice, purchased a camper, solar panels, and set up near the woods in the back. I established a proper font near the entrance where I toss my spare change, hoping to placate any observing Elder Things. I brought a few people out there, testing the man's claim, and all they could remember was my trailer in some unfindable middle of nowhere. They couldn't even recall it being a cemetery. These days, I spend most of my free time here. Despite everything that transpired and the true nature of this place, I continue to find comfort here, and I resolved not to remove what I discovered in the mausoleum. It was filled with tomes, grimoires, genuine spell books overflowing with arcane knowledge, presumably gathered by the man's ancestor. I've been delving into them. You could say I've become something of a hedge witch, and I've planned out my first grand working. I find it unfair that the man had to give himself to the wisps due to a deal his ancestor made. I don't believe in the sins of the father or anything of the sort. I know I didn't know him for long, or that well. I still don't even know his name. But by my standards, What we shared was intimate. He was my friend, and I want to do more than just remember him. I plan to reclaim his spirit from the wisps and make him my familiar. That's why for Halloween 2019, I'll be throwing another party. This time, one wicked enough to wake the dead. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale, Hallowed Ground, Part 1, by the talented The Vesper's Bell. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness, and that you'll carry a piece of the Fear File Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fear File Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, so don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night, and stay scared.